A woman sits alone at a crossroads outside a town called Enaim, her face covered by a veil. She is not waiting for a customer. She is waiting for one specific man. A man who owes her something he has refused to give her for years. You can imagine how long those years must have felt. Waiting in her father's house. Watching other women become mothers while her own body stayed empty of promise. When the man finally walks toward her on the road, he does not recognize her. He has no idea he is looking at his own daughter-in-law. By the end of that encounter, she will be carrying his child, and that child will end up in a genealogy. The opening chapter of a book about the most famous man who ever lived. You don't know her name yet. Almost no one watching this video does. But by the time we're finished, you'll understand why a first-century Jewish writer chose to open his entire account of the Messiah's life with a woman most people would rather forget. You would expect that genealogy to be a clean, respectable list. 42 generations of fathers begetting sons, father to father, king to king, all the way down to a carpenter's family in a town called Nazareth. That is what genealogies in the ancient world looked like. Names of men. Nothing else. If you had opened a scroll like this anywhere else in the ancient Near East, you would have found exactly that, and nothing more. Ancient readers didn't skim genealogies the way modern readers do. They were often read aloud, in public, as proof of a family's legitimacy and honor. Every name included was a deliberate choice about what that family wanted the world to know. But the man who wrote this particular genealogy, a Jewish tax collector named Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience who knew every rule of respectable ancestry, broke the pattern 5 times. 5 times, he stopped the list of fathers and put a woman's name in instead. And he did not pick 5 safe women. He did not choose the matriarchs everyone already admired. No Sarah, no Rebecca, no Leah. He chose a woman accused of prostitution, a woman who actually ran a brothel, a foreigner from a nation Israel was told never to marry into, a woman whose own name Matthew refuses to even write down, and a teenage girl who got pregnant before her wedding night. Here's what most people miss when they read Matthew chapter 1 and skip straight past the begats to get to the actual story. Those 5 names are the story. This is not a boring list you're supposed to scroll through. This is Matthew making a decision, on purpose, in the very first paragraph of the New Testament, to put scandal directly into the bloodline of the Messiah. And if you've ever felt like your own history disqualifies you from something better, you're going to want to hear what he did with these 5 women. This is not a genealogy about bloodline purity. This is not a genealogy meant to make Jesus look respectable to Jewish readers. This is not a footnote of embarrassing relatives someone forgot to edit out. This is a genealogy that says, from verse 1, that grace was written into this family before Jesus ever took a breath. And there's one woman on this list whose name never appears at all. Matthew had every reason to write it. Everyone reading this in the first century would have known exactly who she was. But Matthew leaves her nameless, on purpose, and calls her something else entirely. Stay with me. You'll understand exactly why by the end of this video, and it might be the most important detail in the whole list. Let's start where Matthew starts, at the crossroads, with the veiled woman named Tamar. Tamar was a Canaanite woman married into the family of Judah, the son of the patriarch Jacob. Judah's oldest son, married her first. The Bible says was wicked, and he died young, leaving Tamar a widow with no children. Ancient law had a remedy for this. It was called levirate marriage. A brother-in-law was required to marry his brother's widow and give her a child, so the dead man's name would not disappear from Israel and so the widow would not be left with nothing. This wasn't a strange or isolated rule. In the ancient world, a woman without a husband and without children had almost no legal or economic protection at all. No way to inherit property, no guaranteed place in her community, nothing to fall back on in old age. The system existed to prevent exactly the kind of vulnerability Tamar was now trapped inside. Judah's second son, Onan, was given that duty. He refused to actually fulfill it, and he died too. That left one son, Shelah. Judah promised Tamar that when Shelah grew up, she would marry him. Then Judah quietly broke that promise. He sent her back to her father's house to wait, and he never called for her. Years passed. Shelah grew into a man, and still nothing. If you have ever been promised something and watched years go by with no sign it will ever come, you already understand exactly where Tamar's story is about to go. Here's where it gets remarkable. Tamar did not wait forever for a man to keep his word. when she heard Judah was traveling to a sheep shearing festival, the kind of trip men took when they had money in their pocket and time on their hands. She took off her widow's clothing, covered her face with a veil, and sat down at the entrance to a town called Enaim, directly on Judah's road. Judah saw a veiled woman by the road and assumed exactly what he was meant to assume. He offered her payment: a young goat from his flock. She asked for something as a guarantee until the goat arrived: his seal, his cord, his staff. Those three objects were not small things to ask for. In the ancient world, a man's personal seal was his signature. Pressed into wet clay or wax, it was legally binding, tied to his identity the way your fingerprint is tied to yours today. His staff, often carved and decorated, was a mark of his authority and status, the kind of object you would recognize belonged to him from across a crowded room. Judah handed over, without a second thought, the ancient equivalent of his ID card, his bank account, and his badge of office, because he thought no one would ever connect the dots. He was wrong. 3 months later, word reached Judah that his daughter-in-law Tamar was pregnant, by prostitution. Furious, believing his family honor had been shamed, Judah gave the order: bring her out and burn her. And that is the moment Tamar produced the seal, the cord, and the staff. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. Judah recognized his own belongings in an instant, and in front of everyone, this powerful man, the one who had just ordered a woman's execution, said something that changes the entire tone of the story. "She is more righteous than I am, because I did not give her to my son Shelah, as I promised." You read that correctly. The patriarch admits, publicly, that the deception was his fault before it was ever hers. Tamar's twin sons were born, Perez and Zerah, and Perez became a direct ancestor of King David, of Jesus. Judah, the man who tried to have his own daughter-in-law burned alive for the very thing his broken promise forced her into, is in this family tree too. And so is she. Matthew doesn't hide either one of them. He puts them side by side, in the very first verses, and lets you draw your own conclusions. Now watch what happens with the second woman on the list, because her story takes us out of a family scandal and into the middle of a war. Her name was Rahab, and she ran an inn built into the city wall of Jericho, a city Israel was preparing to conquer. Picture what that wall actually meant to her. Her home wasn't just near the city's defenses, it was part of them. When the Jewish general Joshua sent 2 spies into the city to scout it out, Rahab hid them on her rooftop, under stalks of flax, while the king's soldiers searched her house room by room. She lied directly to the authorities of her own city to protect 2 enemy spies. And when the search party left, she made a deal with the men she was hiding: "Spare my family when your army comes, because I know your God has already given you this land." That last part matters. Rahab wasn't simply protecting herself. She said, out loud, to 2 strangers from an invading army, that she believed their God was real and that he had already decided the outcome of the war. A war her own people were about to lose. The spies agreed, told her to tie a scarlet cord in her window as a marker, so that when the attack came, the soldiers would know which house to pass over. And when Jericho fell, Rahab and her entire family were the only people in that city spared. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades after Jesus, in a work called Antiquities of the Jews, retold this same account of the spies and the innkeeper of Jericho, which tells you something important. This wasn't some obscure footnote buried in an old scroll. It was one of the most well-known stories in Jewish history, the kind of story a parent would have told a child around a fire. Everyone in Matthew's audience already knew Rahab's name, and knew exactly what she used to be: a Canaanite, a woman running a business built on exactly the reputation Matthew's readers would expect. And Matthew puts her, by name, 2 verses into his account of the Messiah's family. Rahab later married an Israelite named Salmon. Their son was named Boaz. There's one more thing about Rahab worth knowing, because it shows this wasn't just Matthew's opinion of her. Centuries later, the New Testament book of Hebrews holds her up by name as an example of faith, placing a Canaanite innkeeper in the same list of honor as Abraham and Moses. The book of James does the same thing, pointing to her actions as proof of what real faith looks like. This woman's reputation didn't quietly follow her around as a permanent stain. The early church talked about her the exact same way Matthew did, not despite her past, but as part of a story about what God does with people society had already written off. Before we go further, here's where we are. 2 women down, 3 to go. And honestly, the story only gets more surprising from here. If you're finding this useful, this channel walks through the Bible this same way every week. Real context, real history, no fluff. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to the family tree. And Boaz is where our 3rd woman enters the story. Here's the part nobody tells you about how Ruth actually got noticed. It wasn't at a dinner party, and it wasn't through some grand romantic gesture. It happened on a threshing floor, in the middle of the night, because a widow decided to take an enormous risk for the sake of another widow. Ruth was from Moab, a nation east of Israel that Israelites were, generation after generation, warned to keep their distance from. She married into a Jewish family that had moved to Moab during a famine. Her husband died. So did her husband's brother. So did her father-in-law. 3 women were left with nothing. Ruth, her sister-in-law, and her mother-in-law, a woman named Naomi. Naomi told both of her daughters-in-law to go home to their own people and start over. It was, honestly, the practical advice. The safe advice. Ruth refused it anyway, and what she said next has been quoted at weddings for thousands of years. But it wasn't originally a wedding vow at all. It was a vow of loyalty from one grieving widow to another. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. There's a Hebrew word for the kind of loyalty Ruth is describing here. It's hesed, and it means far more than simple kindness. It's a covenant loyalty, the kind of stubborn, committed love that keeps showing up even when there's nothing left to gain from staying. Ruth had every reason to go back to Moab, rebuild her life, remarry within her own people, and let this chapter close quietly. Instead, she followed a bitter, grieving old woman into a country that despised Moabites, with absolutely no guarantee of survival. In Israel, there was a legal safety net for widows like Ruth and Naomi called the kinsman redeemer, in Hebrew, goel. A close male relative had the right, and the responsibility, to marry a widow in the family, provide for her, and keep the family line alive. Naomi had a relative like this. His name was Boaz, the same Boaz whose mother, remember, was Rahab, the innkeeper from Jericho. On Naomi's instruction, Ruth went to the threshing floor where Boaz was sleeping after the grain harvest, and she lay down at his feet. A direct, culturally loaded request for him to act as her kinsman redeemer. Think about how much courage that took. If Boaz had reacted the wrong way, if word had gotten out the wrong way, Ruth's reputation could have been destroyed completely, and Naomi's along with it. Boaz woke up, understood exactly what she was asking, and honored it. The threshing floor at night was not a place a respectable woman was seen alone. If you understand anything about how quickly a reputation could be destroyed in a small, ancient community, you understand exactly how much Ruth was risking with this one decision. There was no guarantee Boaz would respond with honor instead of taking advantage of the situation. She was trusting a man's character with everything she had left. He married her. Their son was named Obed. Obed's son was Jesse, and Jesse's son was David, the shepherd boy who became the greatest king in Israel's history. Follow that line for a second, because it's easy to read past how strange it actually is. A Canaanite prostitute from a conquered city married an Israelite. Their son married a Moabite widow who wasn't even supposed to be allowed into Israel's assembly. Their grandson was the father of King David. This is not a bloodline that stayed pure and separate, the way you'd expect a royal family tree to look. This is a bloodline stitched together, generation after generation, out of exactly the kinds of people the culture around them said didn't belong. Now we reach the woman whose name Matthew refuses to write down, the one I told you to remember at the beginning of this video. Her name was Bathsheba, but when Matthew lists her in the genealogy, he doesn't call her that. He writes, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Think about how strange that phrasing is. Every other woman in this list gets her own name: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Mary. But Bathsheba gets identified only by her connection to the husband David had killed. Here is the story Matthew's original readers already knew by heart. David, king of Israel, saw Bathsheba bathing from his rooftop. He sent for her. She became pregnant. To hide what he had done, David called her husband Uriah, a soldier away at war. Back from the battlefield, hoping Uriah would sleep with his own wife and assume the child was his. Uriah, a man of remarkable integrity, refused to enjoy comfort at home while his fellow soldiers were still camped in open fields at war. So David did something far worse. He sent Uriah back to the front lines with secret orders for his own general. Place Uriah where the fighting is fiercest, and then pull back, and let him die. Uriah was killed. David married Bathsheba. And for a while, it looked like David had gotten away with it completely. He hadn't. The prophet Nathan confronted David directly, told him a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb, and then said 4 words that landed like a blade. "You are that man." David's next child with Bathsheba died in infancy. The biblical text ties this directly to the weight of what David had done, and you can only imagine the grief in that house. But that is not where the story ends. Bathsheba and David had another son. His name was Solomon. And Bathsheba herself, later in David's life, is the one who goes to the aging king and secures Solomon's place on the throne, placing her own son as the next king of Israel, and therefore in the direct line to Jesus. So why won't Matthew write her name? Here's the most likely answer, and it's not about erasing her. By calling her the wife of Uriah, Matthew forces you to remember exactly whose wife she was and exactly how she came to be David's. He's not hiding the scandal, he's underlining it. He's making absolutely sure you remember that Israel's greatest king built part of his family through betrayal and murder, and that the family tree of the Messiah runs straight through that failure without editing it out. Sit with that for a second. This is not a minor character in a side story. This is Israel's most celebrated king, the man who wrote many of the Psalms you might already know, the man God himself called a man after my own heart. And his path to Bathsheba runs through abuse of power, deception, and the calculated killing of a loyal soldier. If any story in this genealogy could be quietly left out to protect a reputation, it's this one. Matthew leaves it in anyway. 4 women. A seduction born out of a broken promise. An actual prostitute. A foreign widow who took an enormous risk on a threshing floor. A royal affair that ended in a murdered husband. If you were compiling a respectable family history for the future King of Kings, you would erase every single one of these stories before anyone else read the first page. Matthew put them in the first paragraph, where they were impossible to miss. And now we arrive at the 5th woman. The one all 4 of the others were quietly pointing toward the entire time. Her name was Mary. She lived in Nazareth, a small hill town so unremarkable that another character in the Gospels later asks, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" She was likely somewhere between 12 and 14 years old, the normal age for betrothal in first-century Jewish culture. And she was engaged, not yet married, to a carpenter named Joseph. An angel appeared to her and told her she would conceive a son by the Holy Spirit before her marriage was complete. Put yourself in her position for a moment. You are a teenage girl in a small town where everyone knows everyone's business. In your world, an unexplained pregnancy before marriage wasn't a private embarrassment you could quietly manage. It was a public accusation of adultery, and under the law, it could carry the death penalty. Joseph himself, according to Matthew's own account, initially planned to break the engagement quietly rather than expose her to that kind of shame. And he was, by every measure the text gives us, a decent and compassionate man. Even he needed his own angelic visit before he understood what was actually happening. Mary said yes anyway, before Joseph's doubts were resolved, before anyone else believed her, with the full knowledge of what it might cost her. "I am the Lord's servant," she told the angel. "May it be to me as you have said." Right after this, Mary did something you might not expect from a frightened teenager carrying an impossible secret. She traveled to visit her relative Elizabeth, who was also unexpectedly pregnant, and the moment Elizabeth heard Mary's voice, the Gospel of Luke says the baby in her own womb leaped, and Elizabeth cried out that Mary was blessed among women. In a culture where Mary had every reason to expect judgment, this is the first person who meets her with celebration instead. It's a small detail, but it matters. Before the wider world had any reason to believe her, one person did, immediately, without needing proof. Matthew quotes the prophet Isaiah here, written 700 years earlier. "The Parthenos will conceive and give birth to a son, and he will be called Emmanuel, God with us." That Greek word, Parthenos, means virgin, specifically, and it's the exact word Matthew uses to make sure no one reading his account misses what he's claiming. This birth breaks every pattern that came before it. But here's what's easy to miss if you only think about Mary in isolation, without the 4 women who came right before her in the text. Mary's story rhymes with all of theirs. Like Tamar, she faced accusation and possible death over a pregnancy she didn't cause through sin. Like Rahab, she said yes to something almost no one around her would understand or approve of, and she said it before she knew how the story would end. Like Ruth, she committed herself completely to God's plan, with zero guarantee of how it would turn out, choosing loyalty over safety. Like Bathsheba, her story could easily have been reduced to scandal if you stopped reading before its ending. Think about a family that keeps an old photograph on the wall. Not the polished, professional portrait, but the one from a hard year, the one with the relative nobody talks about at dinner, the one that tells the truth about who they actually are. Most families quietly take that photograph down and replace it with something easier to explain to guests. Matthew hangs his version of it directly in the front hallway, in the very first chapter, where every single reader will see it first, before they've even reached the manger. This is not a story about a scandal being hidden. This is not a story about a bloodline being cleaned up to look respectable. This is a story about a God who writes broken people, on purpose, into the center of his own family, and then calls that family holy anyway. Look at what just happened across these 5 stories. Tamar's stakes were personal, her own survival and the survival of her husband's name. Rahab's stakes were national, an entire city about to fall, and a choice that would either save or destroy her family. Ruth's stakes were about lineage and loyalty, whether a dead man's family line and a bitter widow's future would continue at all. Bathsheba's stakes were royal, the very throne of Israel, tangled up with betrayal at the highest level. And Mary's stakes were nothing less than eternal, the arrival of God himself into the world, riding on the yes of a frightened teenager. Each story raises the weight of what's on the line, and through every single one of them, God does not step around the mess, he works directly through it. So what do you actually do with this? First takeaway, the genealogy of Jesus is not a list of perfect people, it's a list of real people. Deceivers, foreigners, a woman running a business built on exploitation, a king who committed murder to cover his own sin. That's not an embarrassing detail hidden somewhere deep in Scripture where you'd have to go looking for it. Matthew put it on page 1, on purpose, for every reader to see immediately. Second takeaway, if grace was written into the bloodline of the Messiah before he was even born, it was never about finding people who had already earned a place in the story. Tamar didn't earn her place. Rahab didn't earn hers. Neither did Ruth, or Bathsheba, or, honestly, any of us. And if you've spent years assuming you have to clean yourself up before you're welcome in this story, these 5 names are proof that was never the requirement. And here is the third takeaway, and it's the one I actually want you to sit with after this video ends. If God was willing to write Tamar's deception, Rahab's past, Ruth's foreign blood, and Bathsheba's tragedy directly into the family line of his own son, then whatever chapter of your story you think disqualifies you, whatever detail you'd want quietly left out of the family photograph, that is not the chapter that gets you erased. In this family, that is often the exact chapter God chooses to work through. Which of these 5 women's stories hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them. If you came into this video believing your own story was too complicated, too messy, or too far outside the lines to matter to God, look again at who he chose to put at the very center of his son's family. He didn't wait for the story to be clean. Grace was never waiting for these 5 women to become respectable first. It walked straight into their mess, took their names, and wrote them into eternity anyway, and it is still doing the exact same thing today.